Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on procurement management documents. Part 1. The procurement management documents covered in this lesson are organized by the PMBOK guide into two broad categories: the Project Management Plan's subsidiary document of the Procurement Management Plan, and project documents that include the Procurement Strategy, bid documents, the Procurement Statement of Work, and contracts. Notice here at this point the Procurement Statement of Work, or SOW for Statement of Work. This is a term that is used only in the context of procurement, at least within the PMBOK guide. Other areas that include things that might be similar to a statement of work or may have been called statement of work are things like the project scope statement. But don't confuse that with the statement of work, which is only used in the procurement context. The procurement process, of course, is all about contracting with outside providers for work that you need done on your project or for materials that you need. The procurement management plan identifies those activities that you'll do during the procurement process and specifies whether international competitive bidding, national competitive bidding, or local bidding should be done. Your planned procurement activities will be significantly influenced by a number of factors, including your organizational culture and structure, which will dictate whether you should be working with a procurement department or other functional managers, and how you should be working with them, as well as different marketplace conditions and local laws and customs. Procurement is a complex process involving lots of legal requirements, and so it's not surprising that your procurement management plan has a lot in it. One of the first things you should identify is whether or not you have a procurement department that you need to work with, and what all of the stakeholder roles and responsibilities are, including yours and your project team and other stakeholders, relative to your procurement department. Who's going to take care of what and how this needs to happen. You'll also want to identify the timetable of your key procurement activities, all of those steps that are necessary to learn about different possible vendors, to get bids from them and evaluate those bids, and bidder conferences and evaluations and decisions and contracts. All of these different steps need to be identified and put into a timetable. You'll need to identify the legal jurisdiction and currency for all of your procurement so that those can be used consistently in all of your bids and contracts and payments. If your organization has any pre-qualified sellers or seller lists, you'll need to identify those, and whether or not you need any independent estimates. There are several different types of risks that you'll need to manage, not the least of which are whether or not you need performance bonds or insurance from any outside vendors. You want to specify how you're going to coordinate your schedule with your vendor and how you're going to control your schedule. And not just schedule, but how you're going to manage and coordinate your costs, quality requirements, the risks on your project, how will you communicate with each other, how will you handle change management. There are lots of questions to be asked and answered, and these should be specified in your procurement management plan. You'll also want to identify those key performance metrics that will be used to manage your contracts, and any assumptions or constraints will need to be recorded here as well. Your procurement strategy will also identify the procurement phases that you need to go through. It will identify them and sequence them and specify the criteria for moving from one phase to the next, what the key milestones are in this process, how you will monitor and control procurement, and what key performance indicators you will use to know how well procurement is going. In your procurement strategy, each procurement phase should be identified, along with the specific objectives for each phase. Your procurement performance indicators and milestones should be specified. The criteria for how you move from one phase to the next. This is like your phase gate approach to a project, but applied now to your procurement process. How you're going to monitor and evaluate progress through the procurement phases, and how you're going to manage transfer of knowledge in your process to make sure that this knowledge flows from one phase to the next, and from your procurement process into your project management process. Your procurement strategy's delivery methods are organized into two broad categories, those for professional services and those for industrial or commercial construction. For professional services, it includes things such as whether or not you're going to allow subcontracting and whether or not this is a joint venture. I'll give you an example of one case in which subcontracting can be a factor. I recently worked on a project for local state government, and we were working on acquiring and modifying a case management system. We contracted with a US-based company, so we were working within the same country. However, that US-based company, we found out later, was outsourcing much of their work to India. In the contract, it specified very clearly that all of the work had to be done within the state. Because this system used a lot of sensitive data, all of this data could only be made available within the state. It couldn't even cross state boundaries. So outsourcing this work to another country was a significant problem and a breach of contract. Moving on to delivery methods for industrial or commercial construction. First, we have turnkey, which comes from the idea that this is something that is completely ready to go and ready to use, and you just need to hand over the key. Examples include a home. If you're building a home and you build it to the point that it's completely finished and ready to move in, that's a turnkey delivery method. Or other examples include a system or appliance that just needs to be plugged into the network, such as a network accelerator. Another example of a turnkey system would be certain types of data centers. There are some data centers that are set up as what they call lock and leave data centers, in which everything is all set up and it can run for months, if not years at a time, without any intervention. Or if someone was providing or selling a restaurant, including all of the equipment and furnishings so that it's ready to go, ready to use and open up, that's an example of a turnkey environment. Another would be a medical center that is built and sold, including all of the medical equipment that's needed, already installed. Other more recent examples include office space, in which there are organizations now that provide and rent out office space, including all of the furnishings, as well as shared facilities such as printers, and even kitchens and receptionist services. This can be a great advantage, but you also need to be aware that it can have some disadvantages. You need to understand all of the details. For example, I was working with an organization that rented out office space from another organization, and this was based in Brisbane, and this was a mining organization. And one of the rules that they had was that there could be no alcohol of any kind used on the premises during work hours because of safety concerns. And this applied not only to different mining sites, but also to all of the offices. However, they discovered after contracting with this organization that the services included the receptionists coming around at about 5 o'clock with drinks to serve at the end of the day. So this is a little adjustment that they needed to make to this turnkey operation. The next type of delivery method is design build. Let's take the example first of building a building. You'll typically have an architect and a builder. However, you could choose to hire one organization that does both the architecture and the building. In this case, this would be a design-build type of delivery method. This is often applied in the mining industry, where you have the same organization doing the design and doing the building of certain plants. I experienced this in Outer Mongolia as I was working for an organization building a new copper mine. And they contracted with one organization to do not only the design, but the building of the concentrator. This is also a typical approach for most software development, because most organizations that you contract with will provide not only the design of the user interface and user experience, but also help to gather the requirements, design the system, and build it as well. This is typical, but it's not always the case. There have been a few times where I've been involved in projects in which the design, or most of it, if not all of it, was already specified. In one case, we had an application that was running on Apple devices, on the Apple iPhone, and it was developed using PhoneGap. And so there were a few things about it that they didn't like, including performance, and the look and feel wasn't quite right. But otherwise, the functionality and everything was all designed. And so our job was simply to convert this to a native iOS application using the same functionality and very similar design. Then the next step to this was even simpler, in that the design was already specified by the time this native iOS application was built, and it simply needed to be converted over into an Android app and run on Android devices. So in that case, the design was completely done, and it just needed to be ported or converted to an Android app. The next delivery method is design, bid, build. This is a little bit different, and not quite what it might appear to be, because in this case, the buyer will hire an architect or an engineer that leads the design. This lead architect or engineer usually hire or engage other engineers in civil, structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, safety, or environmental engineering. But you have just this one lead architect or engineer in charge of it all. Then this design that they come up with goes out to bid. And then usually that bid is awarded to a general contractor who has lots of subcontractors working for them. Next, we have design, build, operate. This is when the client or the buyer retains ownership, and this is most often used in public-private partnerships to build things like toll roads or power plants or water systems. In this case, the buyer continues to own whatever is built, but then the vendor who builds it operates it for a number of years and benefits from this operation and receives some sort of commission or percentage of the income from these different facilities. Finally, we have build, own, operate, and transfer as a type of delivery method. This is similar to the previous one in that it's used most often with public-private partnerships. But in this case, the provider, the one who's building this, is the one who owns it up to a certain point and benefits from the income. And then at a certain point, it is transferred to the buyer. This is used for similar types of construction projects, such as toll roads and power plants and water systems. As you can see, these different types of delivery methods have different pros and cons and transfer risk differently. In the case of the design, build, operate, or the build, own, operate, transfer, you can see that there's an incentive here for the builder to make sure they do a really good job, because they're the ones that are going to need to operate it for years, and their future income will depend on the long-term opportunities as well as the long-term maintenance costs. So they're going to want to build something that runs well. So this helps to mitigate the risk of someone building something to specifications, but not necessarily something that's going to last and function as well as you might like. Using a design, build, operate, or build, own, operate, transfer approach can also provide you with the needed expertise to operate these sorts of facilities that you wouldn't otherwise have within your organization. On the other hand, there are also some risks to these types of long-term relationships you get with design, build, operate, and build, own, operate, transfer. In particular, you get locked into some long-term pricing as far as how you're going to share revenues. And so this can be somewhat risky, depending on how things change in the environment and the economy over this period of time. Because of these risks, the operator or provider may overprice this somewhat in order to try and shield themselves from these kinds of risks. Or, on the other hand, they may underprice it and end up going bankrupt and leaving you in a really difficult situation. As you can see, there's a lot to consider and lots of different pros and cons to different approaches when it comes to procurement, which is why most large organizations will have a procurement department and experts that you should work with and consult with in coming up with the best way to manage procurement, including the best way to approach it and set it up and find the best vendors and have the best long-term relationship with those vendors. The Procurement Statement of Work, or SOW, defines that portion of the project's scope baseline that you want to outsource and that you intend to include in the contract with an outside or outsourced partner or provider. The scope baseline includes the project scope statement, which is very detailed, the work breakdown structure, and the WBS dictionary. Together, these three specify the framework and the details of the scope of the project. You decide how much of this work you want or need to outsource and put this into the procurement statement of work. It should include all of the work's requirements and specifications, the quantity desired if applicable, the quality requirements, the performance requirements and how they'll be reported, how long the seller has to complete the work, where it is expected or in some cases legally required that the work be done, and so on. The purpose of the procurement statement of work is to provide a complete specification of all of the work to be done, and it needs to be clear and to have sufficient detail for potential suppliers to confidently provide accurate estimates and bids for the work, and to avoid any ambiguity, misunderstandings, and disagreements later on in the project. How detailed does it need to be? That depends a lot on the audience. When you create your scope baseline for internal use, you can usually get by with much less detail than when you're outsourcing the work. This is because internally, you can rely on your organization's culture, policies, procedures, and structure to fill in these details. Your organization will have certain expectations of quality and safety and such that you don't have to spell out for your internal resources, which you will have to provide in more detail when you outsource. The level of detail needed can also depend on the relationship you have with this vendor. If you've worked together in the past and they're already familiar with your organization's expectations and they have been able to fulfill these expectations well in the past and they're interested in a continuing long-term relationship, then that's very different from a vendor that you've never worked with before. For example, I once managed a small project that had a pre-assigned team developing a web-based application to manage the plans for purchasing those gigantic tires that you need for mining trucks. You know, the trucks that are the size of a house. Well, one of the pages of this application was to show the schedule of tires planned or on order from various manufacturers for the next several months. It was a relatively large table laid out on a grid like a spreadsheet, and you'd have to scroll a couple of times to see the whole thing. The problem was, this page took about a full minute to load. Way too long. We ended up having someone else fix it, and it only took them a couple of days, and they had it loading in just a few seconds. It's quite common for us to assume that web pages or screens will load in a reasonable amount of time, and for us to not specifically define how long is too long. When working with internal people or vendors with which you have a good established relationship, that's usually okay, but it's not okay when working with new people in new organizations. You have to be more specific. I knew a project manager who had a similar situation. He outsourced an application to a company in another country, and he didn't account for the fact that this other country has a culture for doing exactly as requested and no more. So the screen that they requested to have the ability to add and edit users, well, it did allow you to add and edit users, but unfortunately, it didn't allow you to delete users. Nobody asked for delete specifically, so it wasn't provided. And so this project manager had to issue a change request to get the delete feature added. If it's not already specified in the standard terms and conditions of the contract, and your project deals with sensitive information, then your statement of work will need to be specific about where work can be done, where sensitive data can reside, who can access it, and under what circumstances, how copies of this data will be protected and eventually destroyed when no longer needed, and so on. If you're contracting for the development of a software system, how will you ensure that the code is readable and maintainable? What code quality standards will you include in your procurement statement of work? And how will you measure to these standards? These are all questions that you should address in your procurement statement of work. Sometimes even simple terms can be ambiguous. I once managed a project that was based on a third-party vendor's software application, and this application needed to be configured to the client's needs, including loading it with the client's existing data and configuring the settings to meet the client's preferences. One of the milestones in the contract, upon which a significant payment was based, was the deployment of the system. Now you'd think that this means, when everything's all said and done, kind of a final deployment. Well, the vendor created a blank, unconfigured version of the system and provided access to a couple of the client's team members, and then sent in a bill for the deployment of the system. Naturally, we argued that the system wasn't deployed because it hadn't been configured and loaded with data yet. They argued, on their part, that the contract didn't say that this particular milestone required any of that, and they felt that they should be paid. It seemed rather obvious to us that they hadn't met the requirement for that particular milestone, but the contract wasn't specific enough to clearly support either position. Fortunately, there were other milestones later in the contract that required them to finish the rest of the work. But this payment for deploying the system was a very unclear milestone. Terms of reference is a term that is sometimes used when contracting for services. Though terms of reference are more commonly used, more like a project charter for things like research studies or investigations or committees. In the context of procurement, it can serve essentially the same purpose as a statement of work. Typical elements of a terms of reference can include the specific tasks that the contractor needs to perform and how they need to coordinate with the buyer, the standards and procedures and processes that they need to follow in order to move forward with this service or investigation, the data that needs to be submitted by the contractor for approval by the buyer, and if there are any data and services that the buyer needs to provide to the contractor in order for the contractor to do their work, that should also be specified in your terms of reference. And also a schedule for the initial submission of this data or report or findings. And if there's a certain expected amount of time that the buyer needs to review and approve or reject the results, then this needs to be specified also in your terms of reference. I'm afraid this is all the time we have for Part 1. Please join us for Part 2 of our discussion on procurement management documents. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.